So for next time, I want you to read the Amy Tan essay in Reading the World, right? The Language of Discretion. And this is specifically going to have to do with stereotyping and with the way we make faulty assumptions about people and about whole cultures based on misunderstandings of language. Now, I also want everybody to keep in mind that next Wednesday, Exploratory Reflection 3 is going to be due, right? So the rules for that are exactly the same as for the last two, but this one, you're just going to be working on this last set of 5 essays that we've been reading, right? So it's going to be, Plato, Aristotle, John Quincy Adams, Audre Lorde, or Amy Tan. Those are going to be your choices. So does anybody have any questions about anything before we start? We're good? Okay. So here's what I want you to do to start off today. I want you to sit for a few minutes, and I want you to think about the following 2 questions, right? What do I consider the most important facets of my identity? And think about these in terms of things like race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic class, right? Level of education, ability or disability, right? Things that fit into categories like this, right? And then I want you to think about how these parts of your identity intersect or interact with each other. Now, before you start writing, I do want to say too, you'll keep this private, right? You don't have to air this to me or to the rest of the class. But I want you to do this thinking before we start talking about Audre Lorde. Because I think that reflecting on some of this will help us understand what she's trying to do in her essay. And here's what I'd like you to follow this up with. This part you will be sharing, okay? Can you think of a time when you were silenced, excluded, or made to feel bad about yourself because of some element of your identity? Now, you do not have to reveal which element of your identity caused this feeling, right? But I want you to reflect on any situation in your life in which this may have happened to you. And see if you can, provide a brief description of that and how it made you feel. And if you're not comfortable sharing it, you don't have to. But I do want you to think about it and write it out.
After I write it, party, like, know what I'm going to talk about.
Pardon?
After party, know what I'm going to talk about. I can start talking about it and not right away.
I still want you to write it out. You don't have to talk about it, but I still want you to write it out. And remember that if you prefer, you're only writing it out for yourself. You don't have to show it to anyone else. So like I said, you do not have to share anything that you wrote if you do not want to. Because I get that some of these, some of this sort of thinking call up some feelings that still get pretty raw, right? But here's why I wanted us to think about this, right? Here's why I wanted us to reflect on this before we proceed with Audre Lorde. So Audre Lorde is an early theorist of a notion of identity called intersectionality. Is this a term that you guys have run across before? Have any of you taken like intro to sociology or any courses? You might run across this in courses on human sexuality as well.
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay. So when we talk about intersectionality, what we are talking about is a process of identity construction in which all of the facets of our identity interact with each other, right? That everything that makes up us kind of intersects. So, things like gender and sexuality and economic class, right, can't be considered in isolation, right? They have to be considered in accordance with the other factors that make up your identity, right? And this comes about as an outgrowth of feminist theory. So feminism is usually described as having occurred in a couple of waves. The first wave, does anybody know what first wave feminism is? Have any of you heard any of this terminology before? Okay, so first wave feminism refers to the suffragette movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And what they were primarily concerned with was securing basic political rights for women. So things like the right to vote, the right to own property, rights over their own children, things like that. Right? Prior to the first wave feminist movement's efforts, in most countries in Europe and in the United States, women's children were largely considered property of her husband, right, to do with as he would. She had few rights over her own offspring. Now, when we talk about second wave feminism, which is a movement that mostly it's a term that mostly covers the movement from the 1960s to the 1980s. We're talking largely about sort of women's right to self-empowerment and fulfillment. So women's equality, social and political, with men. So second wave feminists were typically fighting for things like the right to work outside the home, the reproductive rights, getting equal pay for doing the same job as a man, right? Things of that nature. Now, one thing that is often regarded as a shortcoming of both the first and second waves of feminism is that they tend to assume a kind of narrow, middle-class, heterosexual feminine identity. Right? That was kind of who ran and participated in these movements, and that was kind of largely who their aims benefited, right? In fact, there were some branches of the women's suffrage movement that made the case that if white women were permitted to vote, that would help they would vote the way their husbands told them to, and that would help neutralize the votes of black men. So the second wave movement as well, right, in arguing that women should be allowed to work outside the home. Again, like this was something that largely was focused on the middle-class suburban housewife, right? Women of the working classes, whether black or whether white, black, Latino, right, white people and people of color, were already working outside the home. So, people who didn't fit this particular image or that didn't fit into this particular identity group often felt excluded from these movements. And that's a large part of the perspective that Lorde is coming from, right? That within this particular movement, she feels like her identity as a working class black lesbian gets kind of silenced, right? That there's no place really for her to speak here. And the notion of refusing to be silenced, right, is something that comes with this kind of scrape with death, right? So if we look at the first paragraph of the essay here, on page 154, can somebody read this out for us?
No, I got my book from home.
Just the very first paragraph of the essay.
I have come.
Yep, that one.
I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. That speaking profits me beyond any other effect. I am standing here as a black lesbian poet, and the meaning of all that weighs upon the fact that I am still alive and might not have been. Less than 2 months ago, I was told by my 2 doctors, one female and one male, that I would have to have breast surgery, and that there was a 60 to 80% chance that the tumor was malignant.
Malignant.
Between that telling and the actual surgery, there was a 3-week period of the agony of an involuntary reorganization of my entire life. The surgery was completed and the growth was benign.
Okay, thank you. So what is it here? What has happened to her that convinces her of the absolute necessity of speech, even if it's painful or difficult?
Homer's being taken away from it.
Yeah. She's facing down that permanent silence, right? And, at the time that she writes this essay, she's in her early 40s, or she's about the same age that I am now. So, not old, right? So she's facing the prospect of having her life cut short. And this is actually kind of important in the way she sets up a couple of binaries throughout the essay, right? So the big one is silence versus speech. Right, that is the large idea, the big set of ideas around which the whole essay is organized. But this notion of death looms large in the background here as well. Yes?
I had a question / statement on it. Is she somewhat like Douglas, except his was taken away before he got it, but hers was taken away after she got counted before she could really capitalize on it?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of back and forth. There is a dialogue here between Lorde's essay and Douglas's essay. And yeah, this idea of being robbed of language in some way, right? Being silenced, right? So Douglas has been kind of forcibly silenced by having access, his access to education, his access to the written word, limited, right? Lorde has not been in that same position. Even in her early 40s, she's a published and well-known poet. She has advanced degrees, right? So she has had access to education, and she has certainly made use of her voice. But this notion of having that voice taken away prematurely, right? I think kind of gets her thinking about what speech really means and what speech is really good for, right? Right, if we look at the next paragraph, within those 3 weeks, I was forced to look upon myself and my living with a harsh and urgent clarity that has left me still shaken but much stronger. This is a situation faced by many women, by some of you here today. Some of what I experienced during that time has helped elucidate for me much of what I feel concerning the transformation of silence into language and action. So, what idea, even in the title of this, is she associating with speech and with language?
Essentially her voice.
Yeah.
Same part of silence.
Yeah, it's action is the thing, to speak is to act, right? So if speech and language are associated with action, what's the implied opposite here? What would be on the other side of the binary? What is the opposite of being active?
Like sitting back and doing nothing.
Yeah. If we
Sedentary.
pardon?
Sedentary.
Sedentary, passive, right? Yeah. So silence is passive, right? Silence is just kind of sitting back and letting things roll over you. If you speak, right, if you use language, this gives you the power to push back against the things that want to roll over you, right? The things that want you to be quiet. So, Hannah, can you read the paragraph that starts with "I was going to die if not sooner than later"?
I was going to die, if not sooner than later, whether or not I had ever spoken myself. My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. But for every real word spoken, for every attempt I had ever made to speak those truths for which I am still seeking, I have made contact with other women while we examine the words to fit the world in which we all believe, bridging our differences. And it was the concern and caring of all those women which gave me the strength and enabled me to scrutinize the essentials of my living.
Okay, thanks. Let's pause there for a second. So, I want to focus first on these two sentences here, right? My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. What does she mean here? Why do we keep silent?
Avoid confrontation.
Yeah, we want to avoid confrontation, right? We want to avoid unpleasantness. Silence feels safe, right? Particularly in social situations, where somebody's saying something maybe that we disagree with or that we know is wrong, right? But we don't speak up because that would make things awkward or unpleasant or might expose us to abuse or unpleasantness, right? So what is she saying about this notion of silence as a defense? Does it actually work?
It's impractical.
Well, is it just that it's impractical? My silence had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you, right?
Is she kind of stressing that it does the complete opposite?
I don't know if she's saying that it does the opposite. Silence doesn't necessarily expose you to danger any more than speech does, right?
It's
And I just kind of
repressive.
saying, like, Yeah, you can't say that it's not there and like you sweep it under the rug, but like it's still gonna be there and you're still gonna have to deal with it eventually.
Yeah, the silence still harms you, right? Whatever harm is going to be done to you by speaking, you're still being harmed if you keep silent, right? So there's no particular reason to assume that being silent is going to keep you safe, right? Because the same forces are going to try to steamroller you. Now, if we look then at what she follows this up with, right? But for every real word spoken, for every attempt I had ever made to speak those truths for which I am still seeking, I had made contact with other women while we examined the words fit to fit a world in which we all believed, bridging our differences. So I want you to just kind of look at that sentence for a minute, and I want you to pick out any key words or phrases there, and anything that you think speaks particularly maybe to things that we've read before, or that speaks to some kind of process of thinking about language. What she thinks language is good for.
And we would just go for bridging our differences.
Okay, yeah, bridging, right? Bridging our differences. And what specific image does the word bridging conjure up?
Joining.
Yeah, joining, connection, right? Right, you're bringing two sides together. What else? Like, is there anything else that seems odd about the way she? Is there anything that seems odd about the way she phrases this?
Taking the words that they had thoughtfully selected.
Yeah, while we examined the words to fit a world in which we all believe. Let's just put that up on the board and try to parse this for a second. So this idea of a world in which we all believed, again, emphasizes this connection, right? Finding common ground. But what's the process by which they find this common ground?
Examining their words.
Yeah, it's not just through speech, right? But through kind of careful study and examination of speech and of language, right?
Goes back to the contemplation.
Pardon?
Goes back to the contemplation that we've gone over in the other writers.
Yeah, I mean, and not just thinking about it, but actually putting that thinking into action, right? Through conversation. So, remember what Plato's idea of the search for truth was, right? That we found truth through back and forth conversation, right? And he spends so much time in his argument with Gorgias just trying to get Gorgias to agree on terms, right? So this is actually part of a long philosophical tradition, right? The examination of words to really get at the heart of what they mean. And examining these words to make sure that they, essentially constructing a language to fit a common experience, right? And this is where this notion of intersectionality starts to come into her argument, right? She says, the women who sustained me through that period were black and white, old and young, lesbian, bisexual, and heterosexual, and we all shared a war against the tyrannies of silence. They all gave me a strength and concern without which I could not have survived intact. Within those weeks of acute fear came the knowledge, within the war we are all waging with the forces of death, subtle and otherwise, conscious or not, I am not only a casualty, I am also a warrior. So, she mentions here a number of women whose identities intersect with hers in various ways, right, but not in all ways, right? So in order for them to construct a common cause and common experience, right, essentially what they have to do is find a common language, right? Through speech, they have to identify the kinds of things that they all care about and that suits everybody in the movement working together, right? So they're looking for an inclusive language. Now, what about these last couple sentences? Is there anything kind of interesting metaphorically about the end of this paragraph?
Warriors?
Yeah, there's a combat metaphor, like a war in combat metaphor that she finishes this with, right?
Is that in relation to her fight to keep her voice and not be silent?
Yeah, I think that's the larger war that she's talking about here, right? You know, when she says, I am not only a casualty, I am also a warrior.
There's a war against tyranny and silence, right?
Yes. What does this mean? I am not only a casualty, I am also a warrior. What's a casualty?
Someone who's been wounded or harmed?
Yeah, somebody who has been injured or killed in war, right? So a victim of war violence. But what is she saying you have to be in order to be a casualty in the first place?
You have to be willing to begin with.
Yeah.
You have to participate.
Mm-hmm. So there's strength in this as well, right? Yeah, you might get hurt. You might be injured. You might be killed. But there's strength in waging the struggle, right? Okay. Everybody with me so far. How is this going for you? Like, is there anything that that you don't get and it seems questionable, or that is bugging you for any reason?
Didn't I also feel like it's just like an off day?
I have been having, I'm going to be honest, an extremely off day.
It's been like that for me for like a
It
week.
was so long.
Yeah, this has been a rough week. I'm going to admit that, my nerves are feeling really frayed right now, and uncertainty about a number of things is frankly kind of killing me, and it's really hard right now to stand up here and talk about an essay. However, I think we can power through this because I think this is a really important essay. And I think that this is part of a conversation that we need to have, not just in this class, but as a culture, right?
There's strength in the struggle. Right?
There is, and there's also the fact that this is my freaking job. This is what I get paid to do, right? But yeah, I think that and I get if people don't feel particularly engaged today or right now, right? And maybe some of this is just not going to sink in today. Maybe some of it's going to go over your heads. Maybe some of it is just something you're not really prepared to deal with at the moment. But I think that there's still value in picking this essay apart and talking about the kind of struggle with language that Lorde is talking about. In part because I feel like if more of us were willing to avoid those kinds of polite silences and to speak up, I feel like, we would actually be able to build a more robust and less passive and complacent political culture. But that's just me, right? Like, this is kind of all, and there I'm doing it now, right? I'm playing down what I think. But I think one of the things that has been a constant throughout these essays we've been reading, right, is that in some way, like speech is necessary for democracy. You have to be able and willing to speak your mind and to convince others to buy what you're selling. Plato didn't particularly like that, right? He thought it was kind of a dodgy way of running a government. Aristotle argued that people tend to flock to truth and justice anyway, and if there is if they don't, then it's because there's something wrong with the speaker, right? That the messenger is flawed, is not delivering the message correctly. And Adams associated the beauty of language and the excellence of persuasive language with freedom, right? That it arises out of freedom. But I think that Lorde is actually coming at this from kind of a perspective opposite Adams's, right? Just as Plato and Aristotle are coming at the notion of rhetoric from opposite perspectives, Lorde is arguing that speech doesn't naturally grow out of basic political freedom, right? It's something we actually do have to fight for. And indeed, that freedom is something that you have to fight for if your identity places you within particular marginalized communities. So, Adams is speaking as a white dude whose dad was president in the early 19th century, right? So his view of freedom is going to be rather different from the view of freedom espoused by a black woman in the 1960s and 70s who was the child of West Indian immigrants and who has worked her way up through public colleges and universities to become a published poet. And that was all just extemporaneous riffing. So let's just get back to Lorde's essay itself. I want to look at this conversation she has with her daughter. Can I get somebody to read this for us on page 155, the paragraph that starts with, and of course I am afraid.
And of course I am afraid, because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger. But my daughter, when I told her of our topic and my difficulty with it, said, tell them about how you're never really a whole person if you remain silent, because there's always that one little piece inside you that wants to be spoken out. And if you keep ignoring it, it gets madder and madder and hotter, and if you don't speak it out, one day it will just up and punch you in the mouth from the inside.
Okay, thank you. So how does this relate to the cancer story that she tells at the beginning of this? What's the basic point of what her daughter says to her?
To speak up.
Yeah, and why? What does speech do to you? What does speech make you?
Makes you feel like fruit.
Pardon?
It makes you feel like fruit, like release.
Okay, yeah, release it, like, it gives an outlet for the parts of you that you usually silence, right? And her daughter tells you you're never a whole person if you remain silent, right? She says something on the previous page about surviving intact, right? So there is this kind of discourse of wholeness and fullness that kind of runs through the essay. Now, why might this particular choice of language, this language of wholeness and of being intact, be of interest to someone who has just survived a cancer scare? Essentially, what is cancer?
In many cases.
Yeah, it's essentially the cells of your own body rebelling against you, right?
Cancer, it's just abnormal cell growth.
Yeah,
And they just have this abnormality.
yeah. Yeah, it's the cells of your own body going wrong, right? Going wrong in a way that makes them attack the rest of you. And so she's associating silence and passivity with cancer, right? Because silence works the same way. Right? If you keep silent, if you don't speak up, then all these things that you carry with you, this little voice inside you that is urging you to speak, ends up turning itself against you, and you become your own enemy. And it's not just the society that wants to grind you up that becomes your enemy, right? In the cause of silence, each of us draws the face of her own fear of contempt, of censure, or some judgment, or recognition, or challenge, of annihilation. But most of all, I think, we fear the visibility without which we cannot truly live. Within this country where racial difference creates a constant, if unspoken, distortion of vision, black women have on one hand always been highly visible, and so, on the other hand, have been rendered invisible through the depersonalization of racism. Even within the women's movement, we have had to fight, and still do, for that very visibility which also renders us most vulnerable, our blackness. For us to survive in the mouth of this dragon we call America, we have had to learn this first and most vital lesson, that we were never meant to survive, not as human beings. And neither were most of you here today, black or not. And that visibility which makes us most vulnerable is that which also is the source of our greatest strength. Because the machine will try to grind you into dust anyway, whether or not we speak. We can sit in our corners mute forever while our sisters and ourselves are wasted, while our children are distorted and destroyed, while our earth is poisoned. We can sit in our safe corners mute as bottles, and we will still be no less afraid. So, there are a couple of metaphors that I think are worth unpacking in here. Right? The mouth of the dragon we call America. And the machine that will try to grind you into dust anyway. So she names the dragon, right? The dragon is America, American politics, American culture, right? What about the machine? What is the machine that she's talking about? The machine that's going to grind you into dust anyway. Why would you, okay, what makes you say life?
Well, we're talking about a place for America and them living in America.
And I think that we can also think about this in terms of like the depersonalization that she talks about in this paragraph, right? That
She's saying that even if you do speak out, you speak your mind, and you put your like thoughts out there, there's somebody like kind of walk below you and say your opinion doesn't matter.
yeah, but then if you don't speak up,
You're still gonna get squashed anyways.
yeah, you're gonna get squashed regardless, right? The machine that treats you like a cog, that just helps keep it functioning, like the machine that just sort of grinds you up as grist for its mill, right? Is gonna do it anyway. So you're still suffering the same fate and not doing any good if you don't speak, right? You're subject to the same dangers regardless of whether you speak or not, right? Silence doesn't defend you. Silence doesn't protect you. Yeah, I mean, the whole essay, right, is haunted by the inevitability of death, right? Right, which is, right, as we all know, kind of the ultimate silence. So she's also associating death with this side of the binary, right? With the silence, cancer, passivity side of the binary. So there's, one more thing that I want to sort of note here, and then we'll let everybody go. On the last page, actually there are two things I want to know. On the last page, can I get somebody to read the paragraph that starts with, "For those of us who write," on page 156?
For those of us who write,
Thank you, Serenity.
it is necessary to scrutinize not only the truth of what we speak, but the truth of that language by which we speak it. For others, it is to share and spread also those words that are meaningful to us. But primarily for us all, it is necessary to teach by living and speaking those truths which we believe and know beyond understanding. Because in this way alone we can survive, by taking part in a process of life that is creative and continuing, that is growth.
Okay, so we get added to our binaries here, right? This association of speech and language with growth and silence with stagnation, right? You don't grow if you don't speak. And this is also associated with interrogating language, right? Examining and asking questions of language, right? It is necessary to scrutinize not only the truth of what we speak, but the truth of that language by which we speak it, right? So this takes us back to this notion of finding common ground and bridging differences by examining your words, right? By examining language. That, it's not enough just to speak, you have to think about speech, right? You have to think about the meaning of the words you speak, how your audience is going to take them, right? You have to consider how you can use these words to build bridges rather than to burn bridges, right? And then the last paragraph that I want to look at here, it's also on page 156. Can I get somebody to read, "And where the words of women are crying to be heard"?
You said "and where the words."
Yep.
And where the words of women are crying to be heard, we must each of us recognize our responsibility to seek those words out, to read them and share them, and examine them and their persistence to our lives. That we not hide behind the mockeries of separations that have been imposed upon us and which so often we accept as our own. For instance, I can't possibly teach Black women's writing. Their experience is so different from mine. Yet, how many years have you spent teaching Shakespeare or Proust?
Proust.
Or other? she's a white woman, and what could she possibly have to say to me? Or she's a lesbian, what would my husband say? Or my sibling, or my sibling have to say to me.
My husband or my chairman.
Oh, Christ, what's that?
It's okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Yep,
Oh my
just,
gosh.
okay. Or again, this woman writes of her sons and I have no children. And all the other endless ways in which we rob ourselves of ourselves and each other. Right? So, we can connect this back to Gloria Anzaldo, right? And what did Gloria Anzaldo keep getting in trouble for when she was teaching high school? Well, that was what she got in trouble for when she was a student, right? Yeah, she was trying to teach Chicano literature to Chicano students, right?
Oh, you meant after.
Yeah. So she was getting in trouble with the educational authorities, right? For giving students things that were not part of the approved curriculum.
I'm just trying to have like the writing myself.
Yeah. So, part of the argument she was making is that, no, this is American literature. It's written by American people who are part of the American experience, right? But how is what Lorde is arguing here similar to that? What is she telling? She's speaking here to an audience of academics, right? So I think that's important to note. What is she insisting that these academics need to do? Yeah, that we need to teach texts that come at life from multiple perspectives, right? And in fact, that we already do it. It's just the variety of perspectives in 1977 that you were getting in a university English class or university literature class were those of, basically, white men of different eras, right? Plato, Shakespeare, Proust, right? So ancient Greece, Elizabethan England, late 19th century France, right? So if you're already teaching people whose experience is not your own, right? Then why do you have a problem with the notion of teaching black women's writing or lesbian writing or that sort of, or any of that sort of thing, right? And I think the objection, I think it's interesting that the objection she makes here, the imaginary objection is what would my husband say or my chairman, right? That people would not do these things because they're afraid of some authority figure telling them not to or disapproving. And that we can't let that machine grind us to dust, right? Okay, so does anybody have any questions about this? I know that, today's been a rough day, right? It's been a rough week, it's been a rough year. And I think, everybody is tired. So I appreciate you guys bearing with me today, even though I can kind of see that at least for some of you, your hearts aren't really in it today, right? It's okay. Like you can't, none of us can be fully present every day all the time, right? Yeah. So remember, we're doing the Amy Tan for next time, right? So keep some of this stuff in mind when you're reading Amy Tan as well. Particularly sort of when we're looking at things sort of like about the way cultural outsiders tend to misunderstand language in particular. Remember that exploratory reflection is going to be due a week from today, right? All right. Go, be free, have yourselves a good weekend.